Hi, I'm John F. Allen. And I'm R.J. Sullivan. And we're the Two Towers.
Greetings and welcome to the Two Towers Talk Show. I'm your host, Tower 1, John F. Allen.
And I'm Tower 2, R.J. Sullivan.
Today, I am uber excited to be joined by author Terrence McCauley, who is a writer of Westerns, crime fiction, and thrillers. He is the author of the award-winning Aaron Mackey Westerns published by Pinnacle, which include Where the Bullets Fly, Dark Territory, Get Out of Town, and the fourth novel, The Dark Sunrise, which was released in December of 2020. Terrence was also selected to contribute 3 standalone novels to the successful Ralph Compton series. The Kelly Trail and Ride the Hammer Down were published in 2020, and a third novel, Stagecoach to Hell, in 2021. Terrence also wrote the acclaimed historical crime university series, The Fairfax Incident, A Conspiracy of Ravens, A Murder of Crows, and Sympathy for the Devil, published by Polis Books. He has also written 2 award-winning novels set in 1930 New York City, Prohibition and Slow Burn. He is a member of the New York City chapter of the Mystery Writers of America, the International Thriller Writers, the International Crime Writers Association, the Military Writers Society of America, and the Western Writers of America. And we are, well, specifically me, I'm really geeked to have him here. I've been a big time fan of the Aaron Mackey series. He has been an inspiration to me as a writer. So definitely please welcome Terrence McCauley to our show today.
And thank you very much for that, John. It's really appreciated. Thank you.
And I'm looking forward to learning more about you. I'm the new guy here, but I'm going to enjoy watching John blush and fanboy and giggle and all the rest. So that will be my entertainment this hour. It's going to be a good time. But seriously, thank you for making the time and being here today. I appreciate it.
Oh, of course, no problem at all. I love doing this kind of thing.
Well, we definitely love having you here. So we'll get started on our questions for the interview. As we had mentioned before in your bio, you started out like writing crime fiction. And can you tell us more about your beginnings as a writer, how you came to this calling? Because that's what I call writing, a calling.
Yeah, it is. I grew up with a dad who hadn't gone to college, but he was always reading a book, and it was always a paperback book. It was Lawrence Block. It was Donald Westlake. He always wrote Tom Clancy before anybody knew who he was. My father was reading his stuff before he really hit the big time. Hunt for Red October was one of the first books I had ever read. And I also came from a long line of storytellers. I had, as I've said in other places, 2 uncles who were Catholic priests in the New York City Archdiocese. And they were Catholic priests in the 70s when New York was a very interesting place, and where, especially if you were a priest, you got to see an awful lot of things going on. And one of my uncles, Jimmy Gorman, he was the chaplain at Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. So I used to hear all about the different famous inmates, female inmates they had up there. So I guess you could say my appetite for crime was hatched very early on. Then I started working in an office right after college, and I knew it really wasn't for me. About 25 years later, I spent my whole career working in an office, but my father said I had a talent for writing, and he knew good writers because he read a lot. And he said, why don't you give it a try? Why don't you write something that you think people will read? So since I said and so I said, okay, let me give it a shot. I had taken some courses in college, and people liked it. They liked what I did. They were political thrillers, nonpartisan, just political thrillers. And they liked it. So I said, let me give it a shot now that I'm out in the workforce. And of course, being 22, I put together this huge epic that I wanted to do, where it was set in 1930s New York, but it involved 6 parts. The Irish mob, the Italian mob, the Jewish mob, the mob up in Harlem, and then the war that came to control all of the crime in New York. And my father read it. And I remember sitting there for about 2 hours watching him go through the outline that I had done. And when he was done, I said, well, what did you think of it? And he said, it's as long as a whore's dream and just as pointless. He said,
wow.
Yeah, he said, what you've got to do is, and he didn't just let it sit there. He said, you've got to just narrow down to one family, one of these crime bosses, and write about them. And he says, you can include the others, but you don't need to jump around. This is your first novel. Stay within yourself. Stay within, make a compelling story, and don't have it be the same old thing where the hitman is betrayed by the mob boss, like in Road to Perdition or any of the 1930s movies that you saw, where they did have to follow a certain formula because they wouldn't allow them to release the movie if it didn't. So that's when the idea for Prohibition was born. And I started putting that together, and I workshopped it to death. People liked it. Even people who didn't like 1930s history liked it. And I didn't know what to do with it. I sent out some queries, and we've all been there, where the agents either ignored it or said, well, it wasn't what they were looking for. And then a friend of mine went to their local coffee place one day, and they got a sleeve that said, True TV, search for the next great crime writer contest. And she took a picture of it, sent it to me, and I entered the contest. There were 300 other novelists who had entered their stuff. And over the course of a month, I kept making cuts, rising higher and higher. And then I won. Out of all of these places, I was so happy. Borders was still around at the time. They were going to publish it. They practically assured me I was going to be a USA Today bestseller. And then what happened? Borders went under, and so did my dreams of getting published at that time. So that's when I stuck with it. I wrote Slow Burn, even though I didn't have a place for Prohibition. Slow Burn's like a related story to Prohibition. And I just kept at it from there. And then I met Jason Pinter at Polis Books at a reading at the Shade bar in New York City when they had noir at the bar there. And he said, I like your stuff. What are you ever going to do a modern day thriller? I had an idea of one knocking around in my head. I put it together in about 7 weeks. And then he bought the first 2 books, and then he bought Sympathy for the Devil as well. And I've been going ever since. The Prohibition was first published by the great people over at Airship 27. And, Ron and Rob did a great job with having a illustrated version of it. It wasn't a graphic novel, but Rob Moran did the ink on it, and it was just beautiful. They really did a great job with it. So that was the beginning of my career, and I've been fortunate enough to be going ever since.
All right. So a couple things. I think you heard me react when you talked about your father. I think I can speak for John about maybe it's the difference between living in New York and living in the Midwest. But when you tell someone you want to be a writer, or you're going to be a writer, or you're working on a novel, it's kind of blown off as, well, okay, that's your hobby. That's nice. But then what else are you going to do? So I'm just impressed. I mean, my parents never dismissed it or discouraged me, but I didn't get the kind of encouragement it sounds like you got. It sounds like your father not only encouraged you, but he had some very specific ideas and edits throughout the manuscript. So did your father have some experience in that?
No, he didn't. He just had experience as a really voracious reader. He read a lot of stuff that were mysteries, cop novels, thrillers, and he knew what sold. And he knew, because he would buy the popular novels, and he knew the kinds of ideas that people latched onto when they were looking for a book. He was actually a computer programmer for New York Telephone, and which became 9X, and then Bell Atlantic when he retired. So he didn't come from the literature background. He didn't come from publishing, but he knew what sold, and he knew a good story.
He was a reader.
So he was a reader. And that's where it's important for writers to listen to readers. We all have our own stories. We all have our own ideas, but we ultimately need to listen to the audience so that we have a good sense of what we're doing, what works and what doesn't.
Wow.
Well,
That's really neat.
Let me
Go ahead.
piggyback real quick here before we get to the next question, because you were talking about fathers, and it's an interesting parallel with regards to what you said, Terrence, and then what RJ said with regards to my own father. So my own father was born in 1928, so he was a little kid during the 30s. And
I was in 27, so I get it.
Okay, so but he came from a different perspective, because being a black man or a black kid in that time, in that era, and growing up or whatnot, there were no child labor laws. He started working at 10. He, helped the family. He dropped out of high school, got a job with the post office, eventually got his GED. But he wasn't a reader, but he was definitely someone who liked radio, because that's what they listened to. And so he fostered my storytelling indirectly by telling me stories like he listened to on the radio when I was a little kid. And to attribute to what RJ was saying, when it came time for me to say, well, I really want to get serious about my writing, he was like, you need to go to school to be a doctor, a lawyer, or an engineer. And that was the thing. You got to do one of those three things if you're going to make it. It's even harder as a minority, which was his big hype thing to say. And from that era, of course, that's the mindset. And that was what I was faced with. And I'm not an engineer. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. I am a writer. He never said you should give up, but he wasn't nearly as encouraging with it as your father seemed to be, which was interesting. But it was a parallel that I thought that was worth mentioning with regards to the time frame in which he came up, and the fact that he was kind of instrumental in storytelling, because it was it's a big thing for oral storytelling within, not just people from that era, but also from Black folks from the times from the motherland up till now. That's been a very big tradition throughout the 1800s up until now, oral storytelling. And that was his contribution to my writing career. So I thought that was just something to mention.
And it's great. Yeah, that's a great addition. And it's funny now with the rise of podcasts and things like this, how we've kind of gone full circle. TV and movies were the big thing. And now we're going back to a more auditory version of storytelling through podcasts, just like they used to with the old radio shows. And it's all storytelling. I mean, I always say that anywhere you get your inspiration from to be creative is a good place. Some people sniff at pulp novels, or they'll sniff at popular movies or TV series. For me, it's whatever it is. And in this case, it was radio fiction. It's all there. It's all relevant. Anything that gets the old spark plugs firing is good.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I was just kind of wondering if the encouragement was also a New York thing or not versus the different areas, but it was just a random thought. I can remember the one time I didn't get the weird look was I was vacationing in Los Angeles, where I mentioned to someone that I had aspirations to be a writer, and for obvious reasons, they were like, "Oh, that is so cool," and it kind of took me aback for a second until I realized where I was, and well, of course, they, that's an area where writers are in very high demand, so it probably just made sense. But
and like with me, my father was saying, I had a government job, and John, as you know from your dad, when you had a government job or you had a regular paycheck, okay, that was the solid base, but you needed to have that in their minds. So that's why he encouraged me in my spare time to workshop it and to get better at it. But in no way did he tell me to quit my day job, because you have to have your benefits, you have to have your pension, you have to have that kind of stuff. So he was he really encouraged me when it came to my writing, but he was always like, make sure you keep your benefits and you get your pension locked up too. So it's interesting that he had both parts of his brain going at the same time.
Absolutely. Okay, so I'm going to change. I'm just reading the next question, which changes topics a bit. So I apologize for the shift. But the next question here is, I'm curious about the Ralph Compton series, specifically the difference between writing your own creations and writing in a shared IP. How did the writing process change for you? I guess, first of all, tell us how you got invited into that and then go from there.
Sure. I mean, it was all thanks to my my Aaron Mackey series, and they liked what I had done there. They were looking to start up the Ralph Compton series again in full. They're supposed to be Penguin is supposed to be putting together in Berkeley a new push for those books. So they had space for someone to write 3 different types of books for them. One was for their Gunslinger series, one was for their Stagecoach series, and the other one was for their Wagon Trail series, and a cattle drive series. And so I decided, out of all of them, for me, the cattle drive was going to be the most difficult one. And I think I got a copy of it here. Yeah, I do. So this one was the first one that I did for them, and I even did an original cover for it. I love that painting. That's beautiful. I had no input on that, by the way. They just asked for a scene from it, and I gave it to them. But that one was the toughest because I had seen a lot of movies about cattle drives, but as you can tell from my French accent, I'm a kid from the Bronx. I don't have much experience when it comes to cattle drives. So I did what I always do. I had an idea, I focused on it, and I wrote it out as fast as I could. And when I was done, I said, well, they have to be 80,000 words. I looked and I had 65,000 words, and I had been done. I finished the book, everything I wanted to say, and then I saw the word count, and I was really short. So I said, okay, I'll go back and I'll rewrite it, and went through it again, because I usually come up short in my writing. It'll always be under the amount. And then I go back and I accentuate certain parts of the story and take out others that don't work. And I usually wind up, by the second draft, hitting my mark. This time I didn't. And I went through it again, and I was at 60,000 words. So I had actually lost several thousand words along the way. So then I took some time. It took about a week that I didn't have to finish it, and thought about it. And then I accentuated different parts of his past. And that's how I got up to closer to the 80,000 mark. But that was the most challenging book I've ever done, because it was completely foreign to me. It was my first time writing for somebody else with a parameter that they gave me that was pretty tight. It had to be about a cattle drive. And that's why I find that was one of my most educational moments as a writer. I learned about what I could do. I learned about how I could challenge myself, and I learned how I could ultimately pull it off with a little bit of hard work. And then the other two in the series, the second one was actually one over here. This one was called Ride the Hammer Down. And I even though I was signed on for the series, I always say, this is the title that sold them on my ideas, because this one is a completely different story, because it was the kind of story Western I always wanted to tell. And that was where you got a character who's slowly losing grip with his sanity because he's been humiliated. The sheriff has been ridden out of town, literally on a rail, and left to die. And it's about how he overcomes that, comes back, and reclaims the town. But it's definitely not Randolph Scott kind of story. You get to see the nitty gritty that this poor guy goes through, and that was a very interesting story along the way for me to write. And then the third one is Stagecoach to Hell. This is the one that just came out. This one, I love the cover. It's not the one I told him about, but it definitely looks like the character that's in there. And that's where John and I were talking about. I actually used Stagecoach Mary, who was a real person, as inspiration for one of the characters in that one. So I was right in the order that I wrote them. I wrote the most difficult one first, and then the other two were a complete joy to write, because I was able to go full bore into standalone characters, which I hadn't done previously. And that was a challenge too, to go to your earlier question.
So I guess for those that don't know, and that would include me, what does the Ralph Compton series, what does that mean? Were you writing a specific character? It sounds like no.
No, it wasn't. The Ralph Compton series is basically just Ralph Compton's estate is in charge of
It's
of
the
asking
author's
for
name.
new. It's the author's name, right? And there's
My
also
apologies. See that I told noob at this.
no
Okay.
problem at all. That's why these things are good, so people can understand what they are. So
I
Ralph
got
Compton
you.
was a successful writer in his own right. He's passed on several years ago, just like the William Johnstone series.
I
They
got you.
still have new people coming on.
All right.
But with Compton, it was they wanted to keep three different types of stories going. Now, the Stagecoach one is usually the Sundown Riders series. So this one was only available at Walmart. I think that's going to be loosening up soon. But yeah, they gave me three different tranches. One was the Gunfighter series, and the other one was the Trail Drive series, and then the third one was the Stagecoach series.
And I assumed you knew what all that meant when they offered it to you.
They're very clear about that, and they're very clear about when it's due. And I worked with the team over there about when I thought I was going to be short, and I might be a little bit late with with turning in the first one, the Kelly Trail, and they were great about it. They understood, and I wasn't too late, but I was a little later than I wanted to be. Usually, I like to hand everything in on time.
Sure, absolutely, John.
Yeah. So, I haven't had the opportunity to read any of the Ralph Comptons that you've written, but that is definitely on my reading list. But I tell you what, I have read. I've read this Aaron Mackey series, and I have to say that it had been a while since I had read any Westerns prior to reading the Aaron Mackey series. And before that had been the Zane Grey and the Louis L'Amour, and then the William Johnstone. Those series were like the primes, that was what was the big thing at the time. But I had known you for a while through social media, and we talked for years now. And so when I saw that you had a Western book out, I was like, oh, I got to check this out. And so when I read the first novel, I was like, oh, and it's a series. I was just like geeking out. I was like, oh, wow. And so I started reading them, and I was like, telling myself, now, you got to go to work next day. Why are you up at midnight reading like this? And so it kind of was like one of those situations where I felt like a little kid, like, you're up past your bedtime and you've got the flashlight and you're reading a book, except that I have it on my tablet because I read digitally, because
Me too.
it would look like a hoarder's house in here if I were to buy a physical copy. If I had to stop because it was just I couldn't. And I hate to get rid of books. So even books that I've read that I may not ever read again, if I give it away, a part of my heart and my soul just goes with it. And I was like, I've got to do something. So I read digitally now. But so I'm up at night reading this series, and I'm just blown away by it. I mean, I'm a very visual person. So, when I'm seeing everything in my mind's eye. It's like I'm standing right there. The descriptions that you give of the characters go a long way with solidifying them in my mind. So the question here, after all this gushing, is can you talk about the future of the Aaron Mackey series and the spinoff? Because I was excited to know. I heard about the spinoff, and I was like, I know who he's spinning off. And I mean, the way that you introduced that character, I was like, oh, shoot, look, this dude. And the one thing that I want you to talk about in regards to the future of the series.
Breathe, John, breathe. Take a moment. Okay.
One of the things I wanted you to talk about, too, besides the future of the series and the spinoff, is the cultural diversity in your novels, because that was another thing, that was another layer on top of the writing in and of itself that drew me in. Because Billy, I was like, yes, and you talk. Okay, I'm done.
Well, the thing is that I wrote when I was done with the first techno thriller I did called Sympathy for the Devil, my agent said, well, what else do you have? Do you have any other genres that you're kicking around? And I said, well, I wrote a Western about 10 years ago, but nobody wants it. And I guess you don't either. And he said, are you kidding me? He says, the people over at Kensington are always asking me for Westerns. Send it right over immediately. And so it was originally called The Devil's Cut, and then it became Where the Bullets Fly. And this was the first novel in the Mackey series, where I introduce you to, as John said, Aaron Mackey, who is a former cavalry officer who is now the sheriff in his hometown in fictional Dover Station, Montana. And his friend is his deputy, Billy Sunday, who is also a former African-American cavalry sergeant. And they're friends, they're best friends, and they were when they were in the service. I want to go, as you were talking about what the future of the series is, I do ultimately want to write a three novel arc about how they became friends and what happened with Mackey when he was a cavalry officer, because he's kicked out for unjust reasons. And Billy and he returned to Dover Station, where they enforced the law in his hometown. I'm also a huge history buff, and the more I read about any kind of history that any era that I'm going to be writing about, 1930s was more than just Jimmy Cagney. There was a Depression, the Roaring Twenties, Tammany Hall. I cover those in my books. And when I read about the West, the history of the West in this country, I'm like, God, this whole place has been whitewashed. I mean, it was such a diverse time. I mean, you had, and then I've seen other documentaries since where you had Black people ran wonderful restaurants in mining towns. So they were law enforcement officers. There was Stagecoach Mary, who had her own Stagecoach line. People intermarried in between the races back then. And it wasn't just Bass Reeves who was a law enforcement officer and probably the baddest law enforcement officer of the era, but I wanted to tell the story about where that kind of stuff blended in and made it not just relevant to today, but was actually historically accurate. And so that's why I said, if I'm going to write a Western, it's going to be the kind of Western that I want to read, and it's going to be done in my style. And one of the things I've always done in my books, I've tried to make them as diverse but historically accurate as possible. What do I mean by that? My Westerns, for example, was staying on that. I always have strong characters, strong female characters in them, but I'm also not going to put a Calamity Jane character in there because there just, quite frankly, weren't a lot of Calamity Janes back then. I'm not going to put a female gunslinger in there because there weren't an awful lot of them back then. But that doesn't mean I'm going to write about the cringing schoolmarm either. And I have really strong-willed female characters in my Westerns that contribute to the overall novel. So with Where the Bullets Fly, I give you everything. I throw everything in the kitchen sink at you. There is, as John can tell you, there's tension with Mackey. There's tension with Mackey's wife. There's tension with the woman who was moved all the way west to be with him, who he had an affair with in Boston when he was still in the cavalry. And then there is the Devil's Cut that come to town, the gang that is angry that Mackey gunned down for their people because they were breaking the law. And then they lay siege to the town. Yeah, they refused to, they drew down on him, and him and Billy put them down. And that was the first scene where you get to see these guys are not only friends, but they're tough as hell. And they're not just your Clint Eastwood type people, which nothing wrong with Clint Eastwood stereotypes, but they're thoughtful. And Mackey is sick. Mackey has pneumonia in the beginning of the book. And you don't see that in any other Westerns. Usually the main characters, as I said earlier, the Randolph Scott unbeatable character. I didn't want that. I wanted a character that was believable in every way. And that's how I created all of the characters in those books. So, when I did Where the Bullets Fly, I loved it, and I didn't have an idea for a sequel. But Kensington said, we love the characters, we want to keep them going. I said, well, what would you like to see? And they said, well, put them on a train, because we have some art that we want to use that has a train in it. So had the sequel involve a train somehow. So they used the sequel, they used the train art for Dark Territory. And so that gave me the impetus to not only use a train in it, but also to further the series along. And the series evolves from just the town being under attack, but the town changing as well. And that's why I think, and John could speak to this, that's where the series takes a different turn, and you start seeing the humanity of it. Well, there's also plenty of action and bad guys and shoot 'em ups and things like that.
Cool. Absolutely. And let me interject really quickly to our viewers and listeners. If you have not read Terrence McCauley, if you have not read the Aaron Mackey series, do yourself a favor and read it. And just hearing you describe it is just, if I hadn't read it, it was making me want to read it, so definitely good writing and good storytelling.
Thank you. Yeah. And then, as I was writing it, I said, well, I want to enhance these characters somehow. And I love world building. That's one thing that I constantly come back to in my writing, which was why the Compton series was different, because I couldn't build on any existing world that I had. I couldn't even tangentially link to anything else that I've done. So I that was a fresh new start every single book. With this character, and the field of characters I have here, I shoot off two different types of stories. The first one is going to be coming out next year, and it's about Jeremiah Halstead, who is a half Swedish American, half Mexican deputy of Mackey's, who is more along the lines of a gunfighter. Mackey isn't. Mackey is, and Billy are these brutal, hard-ass, tough guys. Jeremiah, on the other hand, is a little bit flashier. He's faster with a gun. He actually, by the end of the fourth book, takes on some of the techniques that one of the guys he kills uses. And he has a 2-book series that's going to be coming out next year that features Aaron Mackey and Billy Sunday, but they're more of his bosses. It's all him. And it's so funny when I was, and John will appreciate this, when I was writing the Halstead books, I said, well, I got to put more of Mackey in there. I got to put more of Billy in there. And I said, you know what? That's not fair to the character. I'm not going to do that. I can't shortchange Jeremiah that way. And I'm thinking of these people as if they're real people, but they're not. They're all just right up here. But it's funny how I said, no, I can't do that to him. I have to let him stand on his own. And so that was a fun couple of books to write, and I hope that they'll continue in the future.
Absolutely. Yeah, I know John relates. I totally relate to what you're talking about there with the characters living in your head all the time.
Yeah.
So let's see. You actually kind of set up my next question pretty nicely. I was curious how you balance research with your output, so that you're making sure you get the details right and the detail that your readers are looking for, while still maintaining a steady output of new material.
Right. I mean, one of the things that comes with doing a lot of research up front is that I'm familiar now with the West. And so I'm not going to be doing an awful lot of research in what kind of gun to use, or what, how long it would take to get from point A to point B. I did all of that and went through a lot of that with Where the Bullets Fly. It doesn't mean it's not any less important in any other Western I do. It's just that I have all of those facts already imprinted in my mind. But what I try to do is do as much research as I can once I start. a new genre or a new series. So that's specific to that time period. And I also watch and read a lot of the bad stuff that came out too. When I was doing my 1930s novels, I read a lot of the pulps that came out that were just garbage because I wanted to see what worked and what didn't. And I wanted to avoid a lot of the mistakes that they made back then. I also, when I was doing Westerns, read a lot of stuff that came out before they killed the genre with so much stuff coming out, and watched the TV series that I could, read some of the books, because, you know, you can learn from when they oversaturate something. And
Right.
I definitely did that with the Western genre and also the 1920s stuff as well.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, and I tripped over. When I was like John, I had a big pile of everything I could get on the Prohibition era, and the damn pile kept falling over every time I'd get up out of bed every morning. And it was, that's why I said, you know what? Thank God for Nook at the time. Nook was big, and I started doing my research on there.
You know, my next question, if John's okay with this, something that you just said. I'm an avid classic movie fan.
Me too.
And I'd like to talk. I'd like to know what annoyances and pet peeves you've noticed in the it could be the movies, the TV shows, the books. You've kind of hit on it a little bit more. You can get into the gangster stuff as well, but I was curious which ones get it wrong and which ones get it right, and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, in that particular genre, I think it's important that it's not just about the hats and the gats. It has to be about more than that. And I think that's why, some people say, oh, forget about writing about the 1920s or 30s if you're going to be doing a detective story, because it's all been done before. There's nothing you can add to that. That's a lot of nonsense. I think anybody who is called to write it about a certain time period, you might very well have something new to add to it. That doesn't mean you have to be formulaic. The hard drinking PI with the bottle of whiskey in his bottom drawer and the hot looking secretary out front. Yeah, I mean, that's done. But is there other stuff that you can add to it? Sure. Like look at Chinatown, for example.
Yeah.
You have to really think. I mean, that's set in a certain time period for a certain reason. And the period of it kind of fades in the background, and you fall in love with the story and the wonderful actors that are doing their job up on the screen. Same thing with LA Confidential. It worked beautifully. And that's because you had a really great script, and you had some great actors and directors on part of that. And they also did an excellent job of taking what was probably an unfilmable book by James Ellroy and making it into something that they plucked out the parts that worked and ignored the complicated stuff, and they wound up with magic. The stuff that bothers me, sticking with Ellroy, you can look at the Black Dahlia movie, and that was just clearly all costume driven. Detective Squad was another one that came out. Poor Johnny Depp, when he was in the one, I forget the name of that one, but
The
Christian Bale was in it. Public Enemies.
Public
yeah,
Enemy,
the
yeah.
Dillinger one, the Public Enemies.
Yeah.
I'm like, you've got a great director, and you've got probably, for all of the subsequent faults, at the time, probably the most charming actor working today in Johnny Depp. And it just fell flat because it was all about the cars and it was all about the hats. And it can't be about that. If your story, no matter when you're going to set it, but especially if it's going to be a period piece, you've got to work extra hard to make sure it's compelling and it appeals to a new audience. That's why I think, based on what John was saying earlier about reading Zane Grey and reading, some of the other stuff, it doesn't translate all that well in today's audiences because it was written for a different period. People were used to being more verbose back then. Louis L'Amour couldn't be as expressive as he could. Doesn't mean it's not a good book. It just means that it's for a different audience. And today you can be a little more descriptive. You don't have to be as descriptive as Deadwood was. You don't have to be vulgar, because I think vulgarity on the page doesn't read as well as it might translate on the screen. But if there's still plenty of things that we can do and plenty of stories you could tell that are set in the past without being pastiche or without being repetitive.
Good point.
So the next question I have is one that I'll lead into, but I'll also co-sign on what you said, Terrence. So a few years back, I wrote a short story called Bronzeville Blues, and it is in the Black Pulp 2 from Pro Se Press. And it was something that was near and dear to my heart because it was a Prohibition era PI story. And one of the things that inspired me was seeing other Black authors who wrote pulp fiction. And one of the ones that actually influenced me a lot was the late Derek Ferguson. And it was actually his input and his encouragement that helped that particular story to see fruition. And so I, to our viewers and listeners, Derek Ferguson, if you want to look up his work, he had the Dylan series. I encourage you to look up his work. It was phenomenal. He was a very talented author, but he was a very kind and encouraging person. And I had to do the research for the 30s, but this was told from when you were talking about doing things differently, it was told from the perspective of a former soldier, a Black former soldier who served in World War I. So you're looking at some of the things that he had to take into, his part of his development as a person, the things that he saw coming back to Bronzeville, which is a Black neighborhood in Chicago, still there, in its heyday, because, this was Prohibition, this was Chicago, and it had all been done before. But my twist on it was that you had a Black protagonist who was a veteran of World War I, who had somewhat made his fortune over in Europe before coming back home. And he had a different perspective than, just your stiff-lipped, cigarette smoking, hard drinking character. And what you said resonated with me and made me think of that. So I wanted to share that. And I also wanted to give a shout out to Derek, who recently passed away, who was a big influence on that particular story and on other writing of mine.
Yeah, I join you with mourning his passing. Derek was a writer's writer, and I think that's the best compliment you could pay to anybody in our craft. He was he didn't care much about sales. He cared about the story. He cared about his audience, and he cared about the other writers that were looking to keep the new pulp genre alive. He cared very much about the industry, and he never had to put himself second because he led by example, and that was by always churning out a phenomenal story. I can't think of one bad one he ever wrote. And I can't think of a time when he wasn't encouraging. And he was a true scholar of literature and of the new pulp genre, and did what he could to draw as many new eyeballs to it as possible. And he was a giant. He was a huge influence on me, and we're all going to feel his loss for a long time to come.
Most definitely. And that kind of leads into the actual question that I have for you. But I'll preface it to say this. When I read the Aaron Mackey series, one of the biggest influences from a larger than life author who had phenomenal success with their characters for me was Robert B. Parker. And Robert B. Parker, was larger than life because of the stories he told, but also the characters he created. And he influenced me heavily. So when someone were to read Bronzeville Blues and or other works of mine in different genres, there's definitely a comparison. And it's not because I'm looking to be the next Robert B. Parker, but when I'm hearing my characters speak in my mind as I'm writing, the influences of reading every single novel that Robert B. Parker ever wrote that was published and voraciously reading them had an impact on me.
Right.
And my style of storytelling, regardless of what genre. And so I would like to ask you, what are some of the big writing influences that you've had?
Sure. For me, anybody who's read my Westerns, I've drawn comparison to Appaloosa, which was also written by Robert B. Parker, and the Wyatt Earp story that he wrote right before that one, and his ongoing Hitch series, which was Hitch and Cole series, which I think is phenomenal stuff. I mean, it's all told in a minimalist style, but that's great because it makes the reader build the world out far better than anybody ever could on the page. So Parker was definitely an influence on me. So was Richard Matheson. He is the reason why I've tried my hand at a lot of different genres so far. He could write everything equally well. He wrote Westerns. He wrote some crime fiction. He wrote a lot of science fiction. I do plan on trying my hand at science fiction and fantasy at some point. But he was, for him, it was always about the story. And he was always good, no matter what he did. James Ellroy, to a certain extent, about how we could put you into a time period is also an influence, but I wouldn't necessarily say that I would suggest anybody emulate him. I think he gets a little too gory and he gets a little bit too confrontational for the sake of just confrontationalism and sensationalism. Chester Himes was another great writer too. Talk about a hard scrabble existence. He definitely had a different view on the world that he covered in his stories. So and also Stephen King too. I mean, God, he's the way even though I haven't written horror yet, I admire how he can put the horror all in your mind without being too gory on the page. And that's saying something. And recently, I know this book's been out there for a long time. I just finished reading a few months ago, Anno Dracula. And all my friends are sick and tired of hearing me talk about this because they're like, the damn thing came out in the 90s, I think. But man, that blew me away because I had no idea what it was going to be. And then all of a sudden, you want to talk about being sucked into the world. That was fantastic and so well done. And so that's the kind, those are the kinds of authors that have inspired me to try new things and not get pegged into one particular style or manner of telling a story.
Yeah, Richard Matheson's a big influence on me. I'm giggling because The Incredible Shrinking Man was on last night on Swinguli, if you happen to catch it. That's one of my favorite movies with a goofy title, but actually quite profound in many ways. It's one of my favorites. So
now, which one is one of your favorite noirs, since you're a classic movie buff?
Oh, you caught me on the spot and nothing's coming to mind. Okay, so are you familiar? You probably know how Val Lewton.
Yeah.
What's it called? Seventh Victim?
Yes, that's a good one.
Yeah, I love that movie. I love all of his films, but that's what's coming to mind right now. I can watch any. Of course, I got a lot of sci-fi and horror in my background, but I can watch The Cat People and Curse of the Cat People and all of those over and over again. And the look was incredible. So yeah, I'll go with those.
Yeah, I usually go with The Third Man myself because, that one had a little bit of everything when it came to noir. It had the music, it had the atmosphere, it had the story, it had everything. And it also had Orson Welles camping it up like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah,
to
right.
Maximum effect.
I do remember that. Yeah, absolutely.
So, Terrence, I had to mention this because you opened up this, you opened this up when you mentioned Anno Dracula, because upon reading that book, and I've read it twice, Kim Newman did something that has long inspired me in my writing. And some people might not be familiar with the Tommy Westphal type of yarn. It says like all of these TV shows are connected and very subtle ways, but characters have appeared from one show, have years later appeared on another show, which puts them in the same universe. And Kim Newman in Anno Dracula did something very similar to that. There are so many subtle mentions of like literary and cinematic characters that if you aren't paying attention will go right over your head. But if you are paying attention, you're going to be like, oh my God, did he just mention this person? And I read it twice, not just because I found the writing very entertaining, but also because I was looking for those nuggets, because that was something that inspired me to put certain nuggets like that into my own writing. And to this day, I have people that will say, well, you know, I didn't pick up on that, you know, the first time, you know, and you really aren't supposed to. I really don't want anyone to pick up on it immediately. As you start to read my work, all of these things start to come together and they're woven into in then you get to see this overarching thing. So then later on you can be like, wow, was that who I thought it was that you mentioned or whatnot? Because I like to put a lot of history, real history into my works of fiction to keep it grounded and to also be edutainment. So someone can take that nugget of history and research it and be like, oh, I didn't realize this actually happened, because it can be something that is going to educate the reader as well. And you mentioning Anno Dracula just opened that up. I'm sorry I had to mention it, but it was just that I was like, ooh, wow. You know, another thing you and I have in common, which over the course of our other conversations and then today is quite a lot.
It is, yeah, it is quite a lot. And yeah, the wonderful thing about Anno Dracula was, and I saw a documentary on Amazon Prime. It was called The History of Dracula, and Kim Newman is in it, and he talks about who he mentions in Anno Dracula, and he took Victorian era vampires, because Dracula wasn't the first one, and he puts them in that book as real characters, and it was just phenomenal. And then you brought me back to something else I started talking about earlier, which was like the same universe that I try to write all of my series in. You have Silas Van Doorn in Where the Bullets Fly, and he continues as an old man in one of my 1930s books called The Slow Burn, which also, and his family kicks off a whole new series in the Fairfax Incident and the Charlie Doherty books that go on from there. And those books also have Jack Johnson in there, the former heavyweight champion of the world. So it's, and also, you know, all the Tammany figures like, you know, Jimmy Walker, who was the mayor of New York. And it's always fun to be able to, and I have Texas Guinan, who was the original Mae West. She was Mae West's mentor. And that's why writing about certain eras in history is so fun, because if you can find a way to put it in there and that makes it real, and they're not just walking through and waving, it's a much better, it's a lot of fun for the writer and for the reader, those little Easter eggs.
Absolutely.
This question also kind of just shifts things. It may be a bit abrupt, but I think I'd like to get this in because it seems important. Tell our listeners about your World War I novella and the Semper Fi Fund.
Semper Fi.
Oh, okay, yeah, right, Semper Fi, yep. Yeah,
that
Semper
one was, Fi. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That was a labor of love for me. I wanted to do a World War I novel about because I saw a documentary about the hell that the Marines went through at Belle Isle Wood. And I have a friend of mine who's a colonel in the Marine Corps. He's since retired. And when I wanted to do the book, I wanted to do it about one of my favorite characters who I write about, Charlie Doherty. In Prohibition and in Slow Burn, he's a far more jaded character. He's a corrupt police officer of the Tammany Hall era. But before then, he was a soldier in World War I as a Marine. And the book opens immediately with him being shelled in the forest, and how he links up with some other people who've been separated from their unit, and they go on the offensive as the Marines did, and how they earn their title, the Devil Dogs, because they scared the hell out of the Germans by coming at them with knives and bare fists if they needed to in that particular battle and others. So I asked my buddy, who's a Marine, I said, do you know anybody who's a historian who might be able to help me with this battle? And he said, yeah, me. I said, really? He says, yeah, I know all about it. Give me what you got. And we went back and forth over the book and the plot. And he liked the idea of me not getting too specific, because just like anything else, like when you're writing a Western or you're writing a spy thriller, you get one thing wrong about a location, a time, where a unit was, the kind of caliber a weapon is. People are going to pop out of the woodwork and just face clamp you, and it ruins the story for them. So I kept it about a story about Marines at war and what they went through, and gave them a flavor of the overall battle, but I didn't get bogged down in actual specific locations, events, whatever, because it's a novella, and I didn't want to, I wanted it to be edutainment, not writing a documentary. When I was done, it was published through Down and Out Books, a great independent publisher. And I said, I don't want to have any money for it. I would like all proceeds to go directly to the Semper Fi Fund, which has a great mission of helping families of not only just Marine Corps members, but all armed forces families and veterans of our wars. So I figured it was a great cause. It's a great organization, and I encourage everybody to contribute. Any sale of the book, I don't get a penny of it. It all goes straight to the Semper Fi Fund.
Yeah, I don't think the title of the book actually got out there. What's it called?
The Devil Dogs of Belle Wood.
Okay, very cool.
And now I'm going to be, I might be changing publishers, so that might change a little bit, but I'll keep everybody posted about that in the future.
Okay.
But the mission is still the same. So Semper Fi Fund's an awesome place.
Very cool. Awesome. John?
Well, this has been very, very, very fun for me, and definitely informative. So I'm going to pose our last question, which is, can you give us any information about any projects that you're working on right now, or anything that's coming out in the future? What can you tell us what to expect? Especially me, of course, but also for our viewers and listeners.
Sure.
And co-host.
And the host, yes. I've been working nonstop on several projects. I just handed in the second Jeremiah Halstead spinoff to Kensington, so I'm looking forward to that coming out next year. I just wrote the first of 3 book series on Charlie Doherty. It's called The Wandering Man, and it's set in 1927 New York. And there's a lot of historical accuracy there. It's loosely based on the Albert Fish case, which a lot of people have forgotten about, but it's loosely based. It's not as graphic as that case was. And I'm hoping to continue to tell stories about Aaron Mackey and Billy Sunday, and I, hopefully continue my techno thriller series too, the University series. So all of these things are in focus, and trying to push them further down the road a little bit.
Very cool. Well, I want to echo what John said. Thank you so much for taking the time and joining us here today. It was exciting for me, and educational as well, because I wasn't as versed on your work, and now I'm excited to learn more about it. But we talked a little bit beforehand that there are some some things happening with your social media and where to find you and stuff. But do tell the listeners how to find you and what they can expect in the next couple weeks as far as that goes.
Sure. I've got a website that's up now. It's www.terrencemccauley.com, TerrenceMcCauley.com. I wish I had a shorter name, but that's the one they gave me in the hospital.
What are you going to do, right?
Yeah, I know. It's the one I got stuck with. So I also am going to be launching a newsletter. I'm going to also be releasing some podcasts once the new website is up. But the URL works. I'm also on Facebook. You can find me on my personal page or my author page. I'm also at Twitter. It's at @TMcCauley_NYC. And you can follow me, shoot me an email, keep it relatively clean if you can. I'd appreciate it. And I always try to remind any kind of readers to leave a review for any of the authors that you like. It doesn't have to, I'm not talking about just myself. I'm talking about anybody, any kind of author, whether it's Stephen King or somebody who's just launched their first book. If you go on Amazon or your favorite place to leave reviews, Goodreads, please leave a review because it does make a difference. The good ones and the bad ones, because I've learned about as much from my bad reviews as I have from my good ones. So please do that, and the author will appreciate it in the long run.
The author will. I can vouch for that.
Absolutely. So just as a real quick side note, I can't wait. Having read your Westerns, I can't wait for you to tackle some new genres. So you definitely got my attention with wanting to step your toes into the sci-fi fiction and fantasy arena. So I can only imagine with stories that I have to look forward to from you in those genres. So definitely going to be on the lookout for that. Again, thanks for taking time out of your schedule to appear on our show. It was a pleasure having you. Much bigger pleasure for me than probably, as I'm one of your biggest fans.
There'll be times when it'll be reversed, and you can watch me fluster and gawk. It'll be fine. But it was great to meet you. I learned a lot, and now I'm more excited now. I really am. It's cool.
I hope I didn't talk too much. Sometimes I have a habit of going on a little bit, but it was really great talking to you, and thank you for the great questions. It was great being here with you today.
If anybody talked too much, it was me. but I want to let our listeners know that we are also authors, RJ and myself. If you're wanting to check out any of our work or what we've got going on, you can find me at johnfallenauthor.com. And where can they find you, RJ?
rjsullivanfiction.com, because RJ Sullivan is a print shop or something. I forget what, but so we had to add fiction in there. So that's where you can find everything out about me.
Yes, I had to add author because John F. Allen makes beads, and he has been for over 100 years. Him and his sons. So, the things that we authors must do to establish our own identities in this .com world that we live in.
Exactly.
So you can check all of us out at our various websites and look forward to our newsletters and other things. If you want to check out the Two Towers Talk Show, you're more than welcome to go to the twotowerstalkshow.com. Check out some guest blogs that we have from various author friends on various topics. And also, I would like to say that if you are looking for an online community through social media, you can't go wrong if you check out OG Nerds, because OG Nerds is a place that caters to nerds of a certain age, 40 and over, but all 18 and over are welcome. So check them out also. And until next time, stay nerdy. The Two Towers Talk Show is sponsored in part by OG Nerds, a new social media community dedicated to nerds of a certain age, 40 and over, although all are welcome. Members are encouraged to share articles and links on their favorite nerdy topics such as animation, anime, art, books, writing, comics, manga, movies, music, sports, tech, science, TV, video games, RPGs, and more. Be sure to visit them on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
The Two Towers Talk Show is sponsored in part by Showtime Cinema in Mooresville, Indiana. Their friendly staff is always willing to go the extra mile to make your movie-going experience an enjoyable and memorable one. Enjoy the comfort of their new cushioned seating in their spacious auditoriums, and while you're there, be sure to stop by the concession stand and purchase some popcorn where real butter topping is an option. They're located at 300 South Bridge Street in Mooresville, Indiana. We hope to see you at the movies.